and welcome to the Oddity Archive. This show that, given its apparently permanent inability to break out of cult status, I'm just going to go ahead and proclaim is the show that is the most qualified to take a look back at all those old cult VHS distributors. And indeed, that's what we're doing today. So, this episode is my unintentional, much belated follow-up to the first Cult VHS Distributor episode that I did 3 years ago now. And I feel like the formula for that episode worked pretty well, so I'm just going to carry that forward here. We're going to take a look at two companies, one more truly underground and one more mainstream-ish. And so the first time around, we did Something Weird Video for the truly more underground end of things, and then Rhino Records' home video division for the more somewhat mainstream end of things. So this time around, we're going to take a look at, on the underground end of things, Sinister Cinema, and on the more mainstream end of things, Vestron Video. And keeping the formula from that first episode in mind, let's start with the more truly underground label. So let's kick things off with Sinister Cinema. Before we begin, I need to give an extra special shout out to Joshua Murphy, who periodically produces a podcast on YouTube called The JM Archive. In 2018, Murphy was able to corral Sinister Cinema founder Greg Luce into a lengthy interview in which, probably for the first time, Luce gave an oral history of Sinister Cinema, which has been drawn upon extensively here. The complete 80-minute plus interview can be accessed through this video's description box. Be prepared for more digressions than I'm guilty of, if that's conceivable. The parallels between Sinister Cinema and Something Weird Video, see my existing video on that label, are a bit of a wonder. Like fellow cult video guru Mike Vraney, Greg Luce began as a film geek. However, like Vraney, Luce started out pursuing music, just in performance as opposed to business, and swap out Vraney's punk streak for a love of early 20th century classical and Tin Pan Alley material. Anyway, while pursuing music in college in the early mid-70s, Luce shifted gears toward radio, landing a gig with his college radio station. By the early 80s, Luce worked his way up to being the evening jock for San Francisco-based, then AOR, album-oriented rock station, KMEL, or KMEL, or Camel, under the alias Sonny Joe Fox.
As soon as you can, at 398 KMEL. Shoot me through the heart and I'm going to follow you anywhere. Love, light, and flight. Stevie Wonder on the all-new all-hit 106 KMEL. Sonny Joe Fox, a little past 6 o'clock. How the hell are you?
There's something special on TV. Introducing Select Division, the new video cassette recorder from RCA.
With the rise of VCRs, Luce got into the tape trading circuit, sometimes going so far as to rent prints of films and record the projection off the wall with a camcorder. While still spinning records on KMEL, Luce also hosted a horror movie show on local public access using his Sonny Joe Fox alias. While hosting his public access show, the station owned copies of some 1,500 public domain films. As a payment of sorts, the station would run off a 3/4-inch copy for Luce of each movie he ran.
I'll go direct to the point. Your experiments cost a great deal of money, don't they?
In 1984, after being informed that many of his personal favorite films had fallen into the public domain, Luce decided to try and recoup some of his own investment in his hobby. Luce invested in 2 additional VCRs, one VHS, one Betamax, and started running off copies, some I'd imagine originally off-air, for resale, and began posting his wares in publications like The Big Reel. Within a few years, sales were strong enough that Luce's 3 consumer VCRs were joined by a 3/4-inch U-matic deck. This was followed by Luce's move toward acquiring his own film prints, which would ultimately culminate in acquiring his own RCA TK29 film chain, which would ultimately become the backbone of Sinister Cinema. When Luce began hawking his tapes, he didn't really have a company name, so he'd generically list in The Big Reel and others as Horror Video or Monster Movies. The final company name was derived from a local horror movie show Luce used to watch based out of Portland, Oregon, namely Sinister Cinema, which ran from 1972 to 75 over then-independent KATU, Channel 2, or K2 for short. Ultimately, Luce received a call from Sinister Cinema creator/host Victor Ives, who'd caught wind of the use of the name. As it turned out, not only were both men old-school horror movie fans, but also old-time radio fans, and seemed to hit it off. Ives apparently had no problem with the use of his old show's name. While Luce never explicitly states it, it looks like Sinister Cinema became his main occupation in or around 1990. Regardless, soon thereafter, Luce found himself in the unique position of licensing the occasional film and, despite never advertising, selling stock footage for use in commercials, award shows, movies, and so on. Most famously, in 1992, Luce provided multiple prints of Bela Lugosi's 1932 film White Zombie, which in turn made up the majority of the Roan Group's restoration of the film, which remains the standard for that film. In addition, Luce provided prints of The Killer Shrews, The Giant Gila Monster, The Dead Talk Back, The Violent Years, and a handful of others for the then-fledgling Mystery Science Theater 3000, many of which ultimately provided the series' first run of home video releases on Rhino. Luce's print of The Giant Gila Monster was also used on Rhino's Elvira's Midnight Madness series. During the early and mid-90s, Luce took a bit of a detour into politics. In 1992, Congress was floating the idea of automatically renewing pre-1964 copyrights, regardless of actual status. Luce and a few others publicly lobbied against this law, and the bill never came to pass. Another law that Luce railed against was the 1994 Uruguay Round Agreements Act. This effectively pulled all Berne Convention participating foreign works that had either fallen into the public domain in the US or had never been copyrighted at all out of the public domain. While the law was passed later in the year, it was largely toothless. If the original copyright holders, or would-be holders, didn't officially file an intent to enforce, known as an NIE, by the end of 1997, the work fell back into the public domain. While a fairly extensive list of foreign films had their copyrights restored, including a few Alfred Hitchcock films, it had surprisingly little effect on public domain distributors, as most of the films were completely out of circulation in the US anyway, if they were ever released there to begin with.
Yes. See that you watch as I set at the same time.
By the mid-90s, Sinister Cinema kicked over into mostly original prints of films, still mostly public domain, and just a precious few licensed titles, but nonetheless collectively adding up well into the thousands of titles. With the rise of the internet, things really cooled off for Sinister Cinema. While the company always remained solvent, it wasn't a massive moneymaker either. If anything, in the 2000s and into the 2010s, much of Sinister's revenue came from the odd licensing deal with companies like Shout Factory and from aficionados of B-Westerns and such, particularly those old enough to remember them the first time around, if you get the hint. And while contemporaries like Something Weird were able to cross over into proper DVDs as opposed to burned discs, and subsequently into Blu-ray and streaming and the occasional art house theater screening and so on, Sinister Cinema wound up only ever dipping its toes into DVD-Rs, and eventually paid streaming via Amazon. Sinister only stopped producing VHS tapes in the summer of 2019. Starting in 2017, Greg Luce began publicly toying with the idea of shutting down Sinister Cinema, and had already been selling off some of his collection. In 2019, Luce announced that Sinister Cinema would close for good in February of 2020. However, as of this episode, March 2022, Sinister Cinema is still active. As of the most recent interview I could find with Luce, from early 2020, it looks like the current plan is to keep the company running until it's no longer reasonably profitable. So, as of this episode, get 'em while you can, kids. I admit, today's second company, in its own little way, had me fooled pretty good for a pretty long time. So, for years and even occasionally today, I'll be digging through the thrift store bins and run into tapes from the likes of Lightning Video, or maybe Vid America. Well, as it turned out, those were just sub-labels of the much more common Vestron video, which, as of this episode, seems to be making a bit of a comeback. Either way, I think I can kiss my potential segments on Lightning Video and Vid America goodbye. I think we can safely say that Vestron has one of the most unlikely origin stories. Cable movie channel HBO, launched in 1972, was the result of a merger involving Time Life. Yes, that Time Life.
This 2-record album or chrome cassette can be yours for just $11.95.
To order Rock and Roll Era's 1957 album.
At the same time, Time Life, which had been occasionally dealing in film since 1968, had built up its own library of nearly 200 films and a small handful of TV shows. By the early 80s, Time Life had expanded to periodically co-produce new films, most infamously the quasi-revival of Get Smart, The Nude Bomb. However, by this point, HBO was now a massively profitable entity in its own right, and their interest in their occasional film dabblings waned. As such, in 1981, Time Life enlisted HBO Executive Vice President Austin Owen First Jr. to divest Time Life Films' assets. First opted to take out a second mortgage on his home and purchased the video rights to Time Life's library himself. As for the Vestron name, Vestron was chosen by First's daughter, merging Vestra, the Roman goddess of the hearth, and Tron, Greek for instrument, to make Vestron. Roman/Greek goddess instruments. Sure, why not? With the Time Life library in tow, and a fresh, new, but ultimately short-lived deal for video distribution of the GINEN Films library, the first Vestron titles dropped in February of 1982. Among these were Fort Apache the Bronx and The Cannonball Run, available on VHS, Betamax, CED, and Laserdisc. Vestron's attitude towards the home video market was kind of the inverse of the major studios, whose focus was on a small selection of high-priced major titles, like in upwards of $100 a pop, usually going to video rental stores. Vestron's attitude was more akin to MCA's DiscoVision, i.e. early Laserdisc, in that the focus was on lower-priced direct sales of movies and special interest titles, educational, music, etc. The main difference being a much greater emphasis on B-movies over major studio hits. Case in point, in 1983, Vestron picked up the video rights to the Artists Releasing Corporation catalog, most infamously including The House on Sorority Row. The strategy paid off. The final profit for 1983 was $3.3 million.
One hint. What do you get when you cross big laughs with low prices?
I'm really having a problem with this.
And big margins with high profits.
The Comedian's Health Sweepstakes.
Jumping back to 1982, in the name of catering to a number of specific markets, Vestron launched both Wonderlust Video, for adult titles, and Children's Video Library. Wonderlust seemingly only lasted for one title, a reissue of Tony Curtis's 1977 flop Some Like It Cool, under the new title Sex on the Run. Conversely, Children's Video Library became an instant staple of 80s kidvid. At the beginning of 1983, Vestron took on the distribution for the existing Vid America, a failed mail-order rental label that wound up shifting into traditional video sales, bringing with it the RKO catalog and some special interest titles. Vestron's first real hit came with Making Michael Jackson's Thriller, released in tandem with the premiere of the video to Thriller, which debuted almost simultaneously on MTV and Showtime in December of 1983. The home video dropped no later than the end of the year. As part of Vestron's marketing strategy, the retail price was $29.95, virtually unheard of for even a semi-major videotape as opposed to disc title at the time. Despite the heavy rotation of the main music video and documentary on cable TV, the Thriller video ultimately sold, depending on your source, somewhere between 750,000 and 1.1 million copies. My money says around 1 million copies. In 1984, facing a bit of a somewhat self-inflicted image problem, Vestron launched Lightning Video to handle their truly B-movie material, as in horror and cheapy comedies. Not only that, Vestron had a backlog of B-movies they needed to get out the door. And really that describes Vestron's attitude toward the material. Vestron had a habit of bidding for the video rights to almost any B-movie, which granted in the short term worked quite well. For example, the burgeoning field of video rental stores needed back catalog libraries and filler for their new release sections. Vestron was able to provide both for a song compared to the major studios.
Titles like And Justice for All, Cannonball Run, Endless Love.
In 1985, Vestron ascended to the number 2 position in the realm of home video distributors, accounting for at least 10% of all videos sold that year. Vestron was only bested by CBS Fox, which was riding especially high on the Star Wars movies at the time. At the same time, Vestron, which liked to have the occasional major title to its name, was no longer able to secure the rights to any of those movies. All the major studios had gone into home video themselves by this point. As such, as far as Vestron was concerned, the only way forward was to go into film production for themselves. To raise money, that October, Vestron went public with an initial public offering of $440 million. Early on, stocks were around $12 a share. At the beginning of 1986, Vestron officially launched Vestron Pictures. How creative. It took until 1987, but Vestron managed to acquire theatrical rights to two, as yet unreleased in the US, British films, Personal Services and Gothic. In August, Vestron Pictures finally got truly underway with the release of their first proper in-house film, a little thing called Dirty Dancing. By the end of the year, it grossed around $170 million against a $4.5 million budget. The following month, Vestron handled the international theatrical rights to The Princess Bride. It proved to be Vestron's peak. The timing of Dirty Dancing and The Princess Bride couldn't have been better. 1986 had marked a massive drop in revenue for the company, like a drop to the tune of 65%. That same year, Orion Pictures, whose home video issues were mostly handled by Vestron, announced that they were opening their own home video division at the beginning of 1987, in the process taking away the last major independent studio and Vestron's most profitable client. To make matters worse, the two aforementioned British films did next to nothing at the box office. Vestron's attempts at licensing some of their holdings for television proved to be a dead end as well, as was Lightning Video's newly inked distribution deal for Wizard Video. As it turned out, Dirty Dancing was an anomaly in and of itself. Subsequent in-house films like Earth Girls Are Easy, Blue Steel, Little Monsters, Blood Diner, and Class of 1999, the latter two being released under the Lightning banner, all proved to be box office bombs. A stab at a TV series based on Dirty Dancing followed, and got canceled after half a season. In the summer of 1991, seeing the writing on the wall, Vestron sold out to Live Entertainment, best known for its home video issues of action films, for $27.25 million, of course including Vestron's 1,200 title library. Vestron closed its doors in 1992. According to founder Austin First, Vestron tried to do too much and wound up diffusing their own efforts. And I'm hard-pressed to disagree. Even a quick look at Vestron's releases shows a definite schism within the company. If you're curious, these days Austin First runs a property management firm mostly regarding office buildings. As for the Vestron catalog, Live Entertainment was taken over by Bain Capital in 1997, which redubbed the company ARTISAN Entertainment, which in 2003 was acquired by Lionsgate for a cool $220 million. Despite so much corporate shuffling, the Vestron name has enjoyed a renaissance almost as unlikely as its original founding. Starting in 2016, Lionsgate dusted off the Vestron name for a line of deluxe reissues of titles originally released under the Vestron and Lightning Video monikers. As of this episode, the reissues are still rolling out on a fairly regular basis. Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I deliver my masterclass on reattaching those pesky Vestron video labels. Seriously, I don't think I've picked up one of these things to date where the label hasn't fallen off.